It was one of those nights where the rain didn't just fall. It pounded, relentless and unyielding. The city of Los Angeles shimmered beneath the streetlights, its streets slick with water, reflecting the neon glow of passing cars. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, low and tired, like an old man groaning in his sleep. Gene Hackman sat alone in the hospital waiting room, staring at the linoleum floor, as if the answer to everything lay hidden between the cracks. His fingers tapped against his knee, a restless habit he had picked up over the years. He had faced countless scenes in his lifetime, action sequences, tear-jerking monologues, Oscar-winning performances. But nothing had prepared him for this. He wasn't here for a role. He wasn't here for an award. He was here for her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over the tired faces of nurses passing by. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, the kind that sat too long on the burner. A television mounted in the corner played an old sitcom, its laughter track eerily out of place in this house of sorrow. A nurse approached, her footsteps careful, like she didn't want to break whatever fragile grip Gene had on himself. "Mr. Hackman?" she said softly. Gene looked up, blinking as if waking from a daze. "She's awake," the nurse continued, her voice gentle but firm. "She's been asking for you." Gene exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this moment, yet now that it was here, he felt utterly unprepared. He had rehearsed what he would say 100 times in his head, but every word felt hollow. What do you say to someone who is slipping away? How do you make a moment last forever when time itself is cruelly slipping through your fingers? His palms were damp, not with rain, but with nerves. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He was Gene Hackman, a man who had played fearless detectives, ruthless villains, war heroes. But here, in this quiet, sterile hallway, he was just a man, an old man with a breaking heart. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the tightness in his chest. The nurse gave him a sad, knowing look before stepping aside, allowing him passage to the room that held the weight of his promise. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open. And there she was. Emily? She looked so much smaller than he remembered. The last time he had seen her, she had been full of life, laughing, running around on set, always asking him questions about acting, about life, about everything. Now she lay in a hospital bed, swallowed by blankets that seemed too heavy for her frail frame. The machines beeped steadily beside her, a cruel reminder that time was not on their side. Her eyes flickered open, soft and tired, but when she saw him, something lit up within them. A flicker of warmth, of recognition. "Gene," she whispered, her lips curling into a weak smile. And just like that, the years fell away. The hospital room faded. The rain outside became nothing more than background noise. Gene smiled back, though it took every ounce of strength he had. He stepped closer, pulling the chair beside her bed and lowering himself into it. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Did you really think I wouldn't come?" Emily chuckled softly, but even that small sound seemed to drain her. "I knew you'd come." Her voice was different now, softer, fragile, a whisper of what it once was. But the warmth was still there, the same warmth she had carried when they met years ago. Gene's mind traveled back to that day on set, when a young girl with wide blue eyes had walked up to him with an outstretched hand and said, "Hi, I'm Emily, and I think we should be friends." She had been fearless then, full of energy, full of life. And now, life was slipping away from her. Gene swallowed the lump in his throat and forced a smirk. "You really think I'd leave you hanging? That's not my style." Emily's smile widened, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "No, it's not." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain tapped against the window, the only sound between them. Gene wished he could freeze this moment, stretch it out, Make it last. She broke the silence first. "You remember the scene?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gene knew exactly what she meant. He nodded, his throat tightening. "I remember." Emily's eyes softened. "Can we do it again? Just one last time?" His heart clenched. She wasn't asking for a story. She wasn't asking for a memory. She was asking for goodbye. Gene closed his eyes for a brief moment, gathering himself. Then he reached out, gently sliding his arms around her frail body, pulling her close. She melted into him, her small frame fitting perfectly against his, just as it had years ago. The moment stretched between them, timeless, weightless. Emily exhaled, her breath warm against his chest. "Just like before," she murmured. Gene held her a little tighter, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like before, sweetheart." And for a moment, it was. For a moment, there was no hospital room, no beeping monitors, no rain pounding against the window. There was only them, two souls, wrapped in a memory that would outlive time itself. The silence in the room was thick, the kind that carried unspoken words and unshed tears. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking through, a cruel metronome counting down moments neither of them wanted to lose. Gene Hackman had held many people in his arms throughout his career, co-stars, fellow actors, characters who existed only in the scripts he read. But holding Emily now, feeling the frailty of her body against his chest, was different. This wasn't a role. This wasn't a scene that could be reshot if something didn't go right. This was real. And it was slipping away. Emily's breathing was slow, each inhale feeling like it took effort. Yet, even in her exhaustion, she found the strength to smile. "You were always my favorite," she murmured against his chest. Gene let out a soft chuckle, though there was sadness behind it. "You should aim higher, kid. There are plenty of better actors out there." She tilted her head up slightly, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. "Nope, not to me." His heart clenched. It was strange, how life worked, how a random casting decision years ago had led to this deep, unshakable bond between a veteran actor and a little girl who had barely begun her journey. The first time they had met was on the set of a crime thriller, one of those gritty, emotionally charged films where Gene played a grizzled ex-detective trying to save a young girl from a dangerous world. That girl had been Emily. She had been 11 years old, full of energy, her enthusiasm contagious. Unlike many child actors, she wasn't in it for fame or attention. She loved acting, she loved storytelling, and more than anything, she loved connecting with people. Gene remembered how, on the very first day of filming, she had marched right up to him, extended her tiny hand, and said, "Hi, I'm Emily, and I think we should be friends." No hesitation, no fear. Gene had raised an eyebrow, amused by her confidence. "Oh, yeah? And why's that?" She grinned. "Because I like you, and I don't think you have enough friends." He had laughed, shaking her hand. "You might be onto something, kid." And from that moment on, they had been inseparable. Between takes, she would follow him around, bombarding him with questions. "How do you cry on cue? Did you always want to be an actor? Is it true you punched someone on set once?" Gene had humored her, answering every question, even the ridiculous ones. She had a way of making even the longest, most exhausting days feel lighter. But the scene that had sealed their bond, the one neither of them ever forgot, was the emotional climax of the film. In the movie, Gene's character, a broken man who had lost everything, was finally forced to say goodbye to the girl he had spent the whole film trying to protect. The script called for a hug, an embrace filled with all the love, pain, and unspoken words between them. The cameras rolled. Gene had wrapped his arms around Emily, holding her tightly, and suddenly something unexpected happened. She melted into him. not as an actress playing a role, but as a little girl who needed that hug. She had clung to him, burying her face in his chest, and when the director called, "Cut!" she hadn't let go. She had looked up at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "That felt real." Jean had swallowed the lump in his throat, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That's because it was real, kid." From that day on, their connection had been more than just on-screen chemistry. It was something deeper, something real. And now, all these years later, here they were again. Emily, frail and fighting for every breath. Jean holding her like he had all those years ago, but this time knowing that he couldn't save her. He forced himself to smile, trying to bring some warmth back into the moment. "You remember how you used to steal all the peanut M&Ms from craft services?" Emily let out a soft laugh, her body shaking slightly against his. "I didn't steal them. I borrowed them." Jean snorted. "Borrowing implies you plan to return them." "Okay, fine," she said with a smirk. "I stole them, but only because you always took the good ones first." He shook his head. "You were a menace." She grinned, but then a shadow passed over her face. Her smile faltered. "I miss it," she said softly. "The sets, the cameras, the people. I miss pretending to be someone else for a little while." Jean squeezed her hand. "You didn't just pretend, kid. You were those characters. You brought them to life." Her fingers tightened around his. "I wish I had more time." The words were soft, but they hit him like a punch to the gut. Jean inhaled sharply, blinking back the sting in his eyes. He wanted to say something comforting, something profound. But what do you say to a young girl who knows she's running out of time? He cleared his throat, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Hey," he said gently. "You remember that thing I always told you on set?" Emily's brow furrowed in thought before her eyes lit up. "Make every scene count?" He nodded. "That's right. And you did, Emily. You made it count." Every single second she smiled at him, her eyes glassy with emotion. "So did you." For a long moment they just sat there, her hand resting in his, the hospital room fading away. And then, after a pause, Emily whispered, "Will you stay? Just a little longer?" Jean felt his chest tighten. "I'm not going anywhere, kiddo." Emily let out a breath, her fingers curling against his palm. "Good," she murmured. "That's good." And then she closed her eyes. Not for the last time. Not yet. But Jean knew, he knew, that the moment was coming. So he held her hand a little tighter, afraid to let go, afraid to say goodbye. The past and present blurred in Jean's mind as he sat beside Emily's hospital bed, his fingers still curled gently around hers. The warmth of her skin was faint, like the last embers of a dying fire, and yet she still managed to hold on. She wanted one last moment, one last chance to relive the scene that had meant everything to them both. Jean could feel the weight of that memory pressing against his chest. He could still hear the echo of the director's voice, the hum of the cameras rolling, the hush that had fallen over the set as they filmed the moment that would stay with him forever. It had started as just another scene, another carefully rehearsed, scripted exchange between an aging detective and the little girl he had fought so hard to protect. But then something had changed. On set. 3 years ago. The set was quiet, too quiet, a rare thing for a film production where the buzz of lights, the shuffle of crew members, and the constant hum of activity never really stopped. But in that moment, as the cameras focused on Jean and Emily, the silence was absolute. The scene was simple. Jean's character, battered and exhausted, had finally reached the end of the road. He had to let her go, send her away to safety, knowing he would never see her again. The script called for him to kneel down, say a few tearful words, and hug her tightly before walking away. It should have been just another take, just another emotional moment crafted for the audience. But the second Gene pulled Emily into his arms, the world outside the scene disappeared. She didn't just act, she felt it. Her small frame trembled against his chest, her fingers clutching the fabric of his coat. It wasn't just her character saying goodbye. It was Emily. And in that moment, it wasn't just Gene's character holding her. It was him. Gene had never been a father. He had spent his life on sets, in front of cameras, playing roles that weren't his own. But in that instant, something real cracked open inside him. His arms tightened around her, and for the first time in his career, he forgot about the cameras, the script, the crew watching from the sidelines. This wasn't acting. This was truth. When the director finally called, "Cut!" nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily had kept her face buried in his chest, refusing to let go. And neither had he. When she finally pulled back, her cheeks were damp with real tears. She wiped them away quickly, sniffling, embarrassed by the rawness of the moment. "That felt real," she whispered. Gene swallowed the lump in his throat, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That's because it was real, kid." It was that moment, their unspoken connection, the undeniable bond between them, that had made the scene unforgettable. It was that moment that had made Emily insist on calling him long after filming wrapped, keeping in touch, checking in on him even when her own world was falling apart. It was that moment that had brought him here, to this hospital room, holding her one last time. Back in the hospital room. The weight of that memory sat heavy in Gene's chest as he pulled Emily closer, cradling her frail body the same way he had that day on set. "Just like before," she murmured, her voice barely more than a breath. Gene swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Just like before, sweetheart." She let out a slow, content sigh, her body relaxing against his. For a moment, she wasn't sick. She wasn't in pain. She was just a girl, safe in the arms of someone who loved her. Time stretched and folded in on itself, the years between them disappearing. Gene closed his eyes, resting his chin lightly atop her head. He wasn't ready. He would never be ready. She shifted slightly, pressing her cheek against his chest. "You know what I used to wish for?" Gene's lips twitched into a small smile. "More peanut M&Ms? A weak chuckle escaped her. "That too." She paused, then whispered, "I used to wish I had a dad like you." Gene's breath caught. His fingers instinctively tightened around her shoulder, his heart squeezing at the words he hadn't expected, but somehow had always known. "I'm sorry you didn't," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She exhaled softly. "I'm not, because I had you." Gene's jaw tensed as a wave of emotion hit him hard. He fought to keep himself together, but the truth was, he was unraveling. He had spent decades perfecting his craft, playing men who were larger than life, men who fought battles, solved mysteries, conquered worlds. But here, now, none of those roles mattered. The only role that had ever truly mattered was this one. Emily shifted again, her fingers curling weakly into the fabric of his shirt. "You won't forget me, will you?" The question shattered him. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, the blue now faded, but still holding so much life, so much warmth. He cupped her cheek gently, his thumb brushing away the tear that had slipped down her skin. "Never," he whispered. "Not in a million years." A small smile touched her lips, one last flicker of light in the darkness. "Good," she breathed. "That's good." Gene pressed a trembling kiss to the top of her head, breathing her in, memorizing every detail, the way she felt in his arms, the way her voice sounded, the way she had changed his life without even trying. He felt her breathing slow, his grip tightened. He wasn't ready, but he had to be. The moment that lasts forever. Gene had spent his whole life delivering powerful performances. He had memorized 1,000 scripts, mastered 1,000 emotions. But there was no script for this moment, no perfect line to say, no way to prepare for the inevitable. So he did the only thing he could do. He held her, just like before. And when her final breath left her lips, when the last beat of her heart faded into silence, Gene Hackman, the man who had played heroes, villains, and everything in between, held on to the greatest role he had ever known. He held on to her. Because sometimes the most important moments aren't the ones written in scripts. They're the ones we live. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that brought peace, but the kind that pressed down on you, heavy and unrelenting. The kind of silence that came after something was taken away, something that could never be replaced. Gene Hackman had been in 1,000 emotional moments throughout his career. He had delivered heart-wrenching monologues, choked out final goodbyes, and portrayed grief so raw that audiences wept. But nothing had prepared him for this. Emily was gone. He could feel it even before the heart monitor let out its long, unbroken wail. Even before the nurse rushed in, her face a mask of quiet sadness, her hands moving gently but efficiently to check for a pulse she already knew wasn't there. Gene didn't move, didn't speak, didn't let go. His arms were still wrapped around Emily, her small body resting against him, her last breath still lingering in the air between them. She looked peaceful, like she had simply drifted off to sleep. Gene squeezed his eyes shut, his grip tightening as if he could somehow anchor her to the world just a little longer. As if holding on could stop the inevitable. But it couldn't. Nothing could. The nurse hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Hackman." Her voice was soft, careful. "Would you like a moment?" Gene finally opened his eyes. They burned. He nodded once, barely registering the way she stepped back, giving him space. He exhaled slowly, looking down at the girl who had changed his life in ways he couldn't even explain. For years he had been the tough guy, the hardened detective, the ruthless villain, the grizzled hero. He had played men who didn't cry, men who carried their pain with clenched fists and gritted teeth. But now there was no script, no director yelling "cut," no second take. And for the first time in his life, Gene Hackman let the tears fall. Memories that don't fade. The funeral was small. Emily hadn't wanted anything grand. She had told him that weeks ago, when she had first accepted that the end was near. "Just something simple," she had said. "Something quiet. I don't want a big show." Gene had chuckled. "A quiet farewell for a kid who never stopped talking?" She had grinned. "I know, right?" It's almost ironic. Now, standing in front of her casket, Gene felt like the world had lost its color. The sky was gray, the wind cool against his skin. The gathering was small, just close friends, family, a few people from the industry who had known her well. Gene stood apart from them, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the chill. He wasn't sure how to do this. He had delivered eulogies on screen before. He had stood at fake graves, given carefully written speeches, let his voice break at just the right moment for maximum emotional impact. But this was different. This wasn't a performance. This was real. And he didn't have the words. A hand touched his arm, gentle but firm. He turned to see Emily's mother standing beside him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhaustion lining her face, but she gave him a small, grateful smile. "She loved you, you know," she said softly. Gene swallowed, nodding. "I loved her, too." She squeezed his arm, then stepped away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The service began. People spoke, friends, family, people who had known Emily since childhood. They shared stories, memories, little moments that made her who she was. And then it was his turn. Gene stepped forward, clearing his throat. His hands trembled slightly, so he clenched them together, grounding himself. He looked out at the faces watching him, waiting. Then he took a slow breath. "I've spent my whole life in front of cameras," he began, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "I've played a lot of different roles. I've been the hero, the villain, the man caught in between. But none of those roles ever mattered as much as the one I played for Emily." He paused, his throat tightening. "She used to call me her set dad. She said I was the kind of father she always wished she had." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "And the truth is, she was the kind of daughter I never knew I needed." The wind stirred, rustling the trees. Gene swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep going. She had this way of making people feel seen. She could walk onto a set, or into a room, or even just call you on the phone, and somehow, you always left that conversation feeling lighter, feeling like you mattered. A small, sad smile touched his lips. She made every moment count. He exhaled, glancing down at the casket before looking back up. "I don't know if there's a heaven," he admitted. "I don't know what happens after this. But if there is something beyond this life, I like to think Emily's up there, telling stories, making people laugh, stealing peanut M&Ms when nobody's looking." A quiet chuckle rippled through the crowd. Gene's smile faltered, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He looked at the casket one last time. "I'll miss you, kid," he said softly. And then, with a final breath, he stepped back. The legacy we leave behind. Days passed, then weeks. Gene went back to work, back to sets, back to scripts, back to a world that felt strangely empty without her voice on the other end of the phone. But he carried her with him. He heard her laughter in the quiet moments. He saw her smile in the smallest things: a packet of peanut M&Ms at a gas station, a young actress on set nervously practicing her lines, a late-night drive home when the city lights blurred like memories. And then, one day, a package arrived at his door. It was from Emily's mother. Inside was a small envelope, handwritten in Emily's familiar scrawl. "For my set dad." Gene's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a note, short and simple. "I know you hate goodbyes, so let's not call this that. Let's just call this a scene cut. The movie's not over. You're just in a different part of the story now. Keep going. Keep making it count. I love you." And beneath the note, tucked neatly inside the envelope, was a single peanut M&M. Gene let out a breathless laugh, his vision blurring with unshed tears. He closed his eyes, clutching the note tightly. She was gone. But she would never be forgotten. Because some people don't just leave memories behind. They leave love, and love, real love, never fades. Gene Hackman sat in his dimly lit study, the world outside his window painted in the soft hues of dusk. The letter from Emily rested on the desk in front of him, its edges slightly crumpled from the number of times he had read it. For weeks he had carried her words in his pocket, unfolding them when the silence felt too heavy, when the weight of loss threatened to crush him. "Let's just call this a scene cut." He could almost hear her saying it, that teasing lilt in her voice, as if death was nothing more than a brief intermission before the next act. Gene exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the ink of her handwriting. How was it possible for someone so young to leave such a deep imprint? How had a single person, someone he had never expected to meet, never expected to love, become such an unshakable part of his soul? He had spent his entire career pretending to be other people, slipping in and out of roles like a second skin. But with Emily, he had been himself. No scripts, no direction, just him. And now, for the first time in his long life, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be without her. A life rewritten time moved forward, as it always did. Gene returned to work, stepping onto new sets, reading new scripts. The industry was as relentless as ever. New faces, new projects, new demands. But something inside him had shifted. It was the little things, the way he listened more closely when a young actor spoke about their dreams, the way he lingered on set just a little longer, offering advice, sharing stories, making sure no one felt invisible, the way he found himself reaching into his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the single peanut M&M he had tucked inside, a small reminder of the girl who had taught him that the most important role he would ever play wasn't on a screen. It was in life. One day, during a break between scenes, a young actress approached him. She was nervous. He could see it in the way she shifted on her feet, in the way she hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Hackman?" she said softly. Jean looked up, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Call me Jean." She swallowed, nodding. I wanted to say that your work means a lot to me, and not just your movies. I read this article once about how you stayed with that young actress, Emily, when she was sick, how you treated her like family." Jean felt something tighten in his chest. "She was family," he said simply. The young actress hesitated, then smiled. "I just think that's what really matters, you know. Not just the roles we play, but the way we make people feel." Jean stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right," he said. "That's exactly what matters." The invitation that changed everything. Months passed. Jean kept moving, kept working. He knew Emily wouldn't have wanted him to stop. She had told him as much in her letter. Keep going, keep making it count. But something still felt unfinished. Then one evening, an email landed in his inbox. It was from Emily's mother. Subject: an idea Emily would have loved. Jean hesitated before opening it. Inside was a message, short and to the point. "Jean, I've been thinking about how much Emily loved storytelling, how much she loved making people feel seen. I want to start something in her honor, a foundation to support young actors who don't have the opportunities she did. It would offer mentorship, scholarships, connections, the kind of things she would have wanted to give to others. And I can't think of anyone better to help me with this than you. Let me know what you think. No pressure, just something to consider. With love, Claire." Jean read the email 3 times before leaning back in his chair. He closed his eyes. Emily's voice drifted through his memory, laughing, teasing, pushing him forward even now. He didn't need time to think about it. He already knew the answer. The Emily Carter Foundation. The event was small, intimate, just the way Emily would have wanted. Jean stood at the podium, looking out at the faces gathered in the dimly lit theater. Industry professionals, aspiring actors, friends, family, all there to honor a girl who had left the world far too soon but had left behind something greater. "Emily believed in stories," Jean began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to creep in. "Not just the ones we tell on screen, but the ones we live. She believed in lifting people up, in making them feel like they mattered." He glanced down at the small plaque in his hand. The first official scholarship recipient's name was engraved on it. A young actress, full of promise, full of dreams. "I'm honored to be a part of this," Jean continued, "because this isn't just about Emily. It's about every kid out there who dreams of telling stories, of stepping onto a set, of finding a place where they belong." He exhaled, glancing up. "And it's about remembering that the most important thing we can do in this life is to show up for the people who need us." A beat of silence passed. Then a quiet ripple of applause spread through the room, not loud, not flashy, just real. Jean stepped back, looking at Emily's mother, who sat in the front row. She gave him a small nod, tears shining in her eyes. They had done it. They had taken her story and turned it into something bigger, something that wouldn't end with a closing scene. A role that never fades. That night, Gene sat in his car, the plaque resting on the seat beside him. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the now familiar peanut M&M. He rolled it between his fingers, smiling faintly. "You did good, kid," he thought. "You did real good." And for the first time in a long time, the weight in his chest didn't feel quite as heavy. Because Emily's story wasn't over. It never would be. And as long as he was still here, still breathing, still telling stories, neither was his.